The wine bottle hit the stone patio table so hard, the whole backyard crowd froze mid-sentence. Not hushed. Frozen, the kind of locked silence that only happens when reality cracks open right in front of everyone. Half a heartbeat before that, my cousin Dennis had been laughing so loud he nearly choked on his own sweet tea. He leaned back in his chair and hollered it across the entire yard loud enough for the neighbors to hear through the fence. "I bet they called you something embarrassing," he grinned, working the crowd like a man who'd never doubted his own punchline. "Something like cupcake, right?" I set my lemonade glass down slowly. Then I said one word. "Reaper," that was all. Just one word. But the retired army ranger leaning against the garden wall went absolutely rigid. His face drained of color so fast it looked like someone had pulled a plug somewhere inside him. His drink slipped from his fingers and landed in the grass. "That's not possible," he said under his breath. Then he squared his shoulders, lifted his chin, and gave me a full salute right there between the folding tables and the half-eaten potato salad in front of every person I had ever tried to hide myself from. And that was the exact moment my cousin understood he had made the worst mistake of his life. The cookout was never supposed to be complicated. Just a Saturday afternoon at my Uncle Gerald's place in central Tennessee. Nothing elaborate lawn chairs scattered across the grass, somebody's old speakers crackling out classic country songs, the smell of chicken and ribs drifting from the smoker, kids bouncing between the sprinkler and the snack table. I almost didn't drive down. Honestly, I hadn't been to one of these gatherings in close to 7 years. Families have long memories, especially for the people who don't quite fit the picture. In my family, I was the odd one, the quiet woman who vanished into the military in her 20s and surfaced occasionally like a rumor. Most of them assumed I'd spent my career processing forms in some rear area office. I never offered a correction. It was far simpler to let them keep the boring version of the story. At 51 years old, I had learned something that most people only absorb after sitting through enough grief. Quiet is not weakness, and visibility is not always worth its price. But my Uncle Gerald had called me himself. His voice sounded thinner than I remembered. "Margaret," he'd said, "it would mean a lot to have you here." So I made the 2-hour drive. I brought a homemade blackberry pie, and I promised myself I'd leave by 7 if Dennis started getting loud too early. Dennis was already loud before 3 o'clock. My cousin had always operated on volume as a substitute for substance. He sold insurance in Nashville and had the posture of a man who believed every room he entered had been waiting for him. By the time I arrived, he was already circling the yard with a beer in each hand, narrating his own highlight reel to anyone who hadn't heard it before. "Well, look who showed up," he called out when he spotted me. "I thought you were classified or something." A few relatives laughed. I smiled. "Good to see you too, Dennis," he grinned and moved on to the next group. I said hello to my uncle, helped carry food from the kitchen, and found a quiet spot near the back fence where the dogs tended to cluster. Nobody noticed. That was exactly how I preferred it. Around 5 in the afternoon, a dark green pickup pulled into the driveway. Out stepped a man in his early 70s khakis, a collared shirt, hair white and cut close to the skull. Even from across the yard, I could read his posture before I read his face. Some people carry their training in their body forever. You can't put it down, no matter how many years pass. Uncle Gerald introduced him as Robert Hatch. "Old friend," he said, "former army. Said they'd crossed paths overseas back in the 90s. Robert moved through the handshakes around the yard until his eyes landed on me. He stopped. Just for a second, his expression changed. Something passed behind his eyes that I couldn't immediately name. Curiosity, maybe, or something older than curiosity. I looked away first. I should have recognized right then that the afternoon was about to change shape. By the time the sun started dropping behind the tree line, Dennis had shifted from loud to deliberate. He had an audience going near the cooler 2 younger cousins and a brother-in-law who treated Dennis's stories like a television program. He was deep into a tale about almost winning a sales competition in Memphis when he drifted over in my direction. "So," He announced at a volume meant for everyone within 20 feet. What exactly did you do in the military, Margaret? Anything exciting, or was it mostly filing reports? I shrugged. Occasionally interesting. Occasionally, he repeated, grinning around the group. That's it? You were gone for what, 15 years? Occasionally, give or take. More chuckling from the audience. Dennis loved a crowd. He spread his hands wide. Come on. You ever do anything dangerous? You ever actually fight somebody? I could feel Robert Hatch watching me from across the yard. The smart decision was to shut the whole thing down with a joke and change the subject. But something about the way Dennis was performing for the group, the way he kept looking around to collect the laughter, made me tired of the performance in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe because I was worn down. Maybe because 2 decades of making myself smaller had begun to feel heavier than the truth itself. Only hand to hand, I said quietly, edged weapons when the situation required. The group erupted. Dennis slapped his knee and pointed at me like I'd told the funniest joke of the summer. Sure, he grinned. Absolutely, then he tilted his head and delivered what he clearly believed was the finishing line. What did they call you? I'm guessing something adorable. I held his eyes and said it flat and clean. Reaper, the wine bottle, hit the table 1 second later. Robert Hatch had gone the colour of old concrete. Not startled, hollowed out. The kind of pale that only happens when a name pulls something buried back into the present without permission. He was already moving toward me before anyone else had processed what happened. Dennis blinked. What? Robert stopped a few feet away from me. He didn't speak immediately. He was breathing carefully, the way people do when they're managing something internal. 3rd Battalion, he said, very quietly. I said nothing. His jaw shifted. You ran close air support for the night extractions. Still nothing from me. Robert exhaled slowly through his nose. My family swiveled between us, lost. Dennis forced a laugh. Okay, someone explain what is happening right now. Robert ignored him completely. He looked at me the way you look at someone whose name you once read on a list of casualties. There was a report, he said, after Kunar Province. The backyard had gone the kind of quiet that belongs indoors. I set my glass down on the table. Reports are often wrong, I said. Robert's eyes didn't move from mine. God, he murmured, almost to himself. Then he straightened up every vertebra, every muscle, and saluted me so cleanly it looked like he'd practiced it every morning for 30 years. Nobody made a sound, not even Dennis. For the first time in my adult life, the loudest person I knew had absolutely nothing to say. The Tennessee evening moved through the oak trees at the edge of the yard, slow and humid. Every person on that patio was staring at me like I was an equation they had never seen the variables of before. I sat very still. I have always hated attention. This will probably surprise people who imagine veterans coming home and wanting recognition, the parade, the ceremony, the moment. That is not how it works for most of us. By the time the dust settles, recognition mostly just feels like an invoice for something you're not sure you want to remember paying. Dennis finally cleared his throat. All right, he said carefully. I think I'm missing something. Robert turned toward him. Yes, he said simply. You are. Uncle Gerald looked between us with increasing concern. Margaret, honey, what is he talking about? I sighed and leaned back in the lawn chair. It's old business, Gerald. Robert immediately shook his head. Respectfully, he said, that is not accurate. Every pair of eyes on the patio was on me now. Even the children at the edge of the yard had slowed down, picking up on the energy the way children always do before they understand what's generating it. I hate this. I've spent 20 years becoming someone whose past doesn't follow them to family events. And once you crack that open in front of people who knew you before any of it happened, you can't close it again. Robert pulled a chair close and sat across from me. He was quiet for a moment before speaking. You actually vanished, he said. I mean, completely. That was the point. He gave a short sound that might have been a laugh if it had more warmth in it. People talked about you like a ghost story in certain circles. Dennis crossed his arms. Someone needs to start at the beginning. Robert glanced at him and then back at me. You familiar with call signs? Yeah, from movies, Dennis said. Most of them are nicknames, Robert said carefully. Jokes, moments, something somebody said once. He tilted his head toward me. Not that one. Dennis looked at me. You're actually serious. Robert's eyes stayed on mine. I knew Rangers, Special Forces, pilots, Marine infantrymen who came home breathing because of her. The patio went quiet again. I could almost feel people mentally rewinding every assumption they'd built around me over the past 20 years, the distant cousin, the strange one. The woman who chose solitude over Sunday dinners and never explained why. Dennis shifted and tried to recover. No offense, but you're not exactly describing someone who looks like they what? Robert said, and the edge in his voice was quiet but unmistakable. Dennis didn't finish the sentence. My uncle slowly walked over and sat beside me on the armrest of the empty chair to my left. Margaret, sweetheart, what did you actually do out there? I looked down at my hands. Hands that have been through enough that they carry their own autobiography scars, old burn tissue, a crooked knuckle that never set properly. Combat aviation, I said, primarily night operations. Robert corrected me without hesitation. She flew into denied airspace, active engagement zones, conditions that grounded everyone else. I closed my eyes briefly. Most people imagine military pilots the way movies build them helmets, runways, clean and dramatic. Real combat flying is nothing like that. Real combat flying is noise and vibration, and a body so full of adrenaline it forgets to be afraid until the moment it decides to be nothing but afraid. You feel every sound like a physical thing. Every second of radio silence is its own kind of violence. Robert looked out toward the yard. Kunar Province, he said quietly, early 2005. I didn't speak. Dennis frowned. What happened there? Robert's voice changed lower now, stripped of everything decorative. There was a Ranger reconnaissance element pinned down after a vehicle ambush on the eastern slope. Comms were degrading, enemy activity was converging, weather was deteriorating badly. Several of my relatives had stopped moving entirely. Command ordered all aviation assets to pull back, Robert continued. He looked directly at me. One aircraft didn't. I stared at my untouched lemonade. That wasn't heroism, I said. It was fury. Robert shook his head. Call it whatever you want. Those men are alive. People who haven't been through combat tend to use the word courage in a way that makes it sound clean and deliberate. The truth is that courage, in the field, is mostly just what's left after every other option disappears. It's not a decision so much as an absence of alternatives combined with the refusal to accept what the situation is demanding of you. Dennis leaned against the cooler, looking genuinely unsettled for the first time all evening. So you just flew in anyway? The aircraft took fire on approach, Robert said, twice before touchdown. Uncle Gerald exhaled sharply, but she landed. Robert's voice had no flourish in it. It didn't need any. Loaded wounded under active fire. Took another hit during extraction. Got every living man out of there. Nobody spoke. Even the kids at the edge of the patio were completely still. Somewhere beyond the fence, a neighbor's screen door banged open and shut. The absolute ordinary sound of it felt strange. Dennis put his beer down. If all of that actually happened, he said slowly, why has nobody in this family ever heard a single word about it? The answer came without any thought required. Because I didn't want anyone to. Everyone looked at me again. I finally met their eyes. You want to know what enough years of that kind of work does to a person? Nobody answered. After enough war, the last thing you want is to be seen. The yard was very quiet. Robert studied me for a long moment. You've been blaming yourself. Occupational pattern, I said. He leaned forward slightly. You brought 31 people home. Not all of them. Robert's face changed. No, he admitted. The weight in that single syllable was enough for everyone on the patio to feel it. That old ache, not sharp the way it was in the years right after, but present the way certain weather is present, something you sense before you see it move through my chest. Gerald reached over and put his hand on my arm. Oh, Margaret, I looked away. I'd spent years carefully constructing a life where no one pitied me. Pity is its own kind of damage. Once people begin treating you as a tragedy, they stop treating you as a person. You become either monument or cautionary tale. Neither one resembles you. Dennis shifted his weight and rubbed the back of his neck. He was an entirely different person than the man who'd been performing by the cooler an hour ago. Why did they give you that call sign? Robert answered before I could open my mouth. Because, he said, choosing the words deliberately, no matter how deep into the worst possible situation things had gone, she came back for the people in it. Nobody laughed. Not a single person. The sky beyond Gerald's property was giving up its light in layers deep gold fading into purple, the tree line going dark at the edges. A night bird called once from somewhere out in the field. Robert kept watching me. His expression had shifted from memory to something more immediate, the kind of look that carries a second question inside it. Margaret, he said carefully, why did you disappear after Kunar Province? My stomach tightened immediately. There it was. The question I had built a careful life around never having to answer. The air on my uncle's patio changed after Robert asked that. Even the breeze seemed to slow down. No one touched their food. Dennis lowered his drink. My younger cousins looked suddenly aware that they were present for something they didn't have a map for. I stared out into the darkening Tennessee fields for a long breath before I spoke. Because some things don't stay where you leave them, I said. Robert's face tightened. He already held part of the answer. My family held none of it. And there is a moment, a specific, recognizable moment when you understand that a story has been quiet for long enough that speaking it out loud will change the shape of every room you walk into afterward. I folded my hands in my lap. Kunar wasn't supposed to be a rescue operation, I began. Memory works the way certain lights work absent until the switch is flipped, then suddenly everything is lit, sharp and immediate, no matter how many years are stacked between then and now. Fear in particular doesn't age, it gets preserved, the way certain things in cold environments hold their original form indefinitely. It was a standard extraction support tasking, I continued. Small element in and out before first light. Robert nodded once. The weather changed faster than forecast. I remember the sky, I said. One moment manageable. Then it looked like the atmosphere itself was dismantling. We lost our primary communications relay twice before the recon element got hit on their approach route to the extraction point. Ambush, they had been anticipated. Heavy volume, rocket-propelled munitions, casualties immediately. Dennis had gone completely still. What kind of ambush? The kind where not everyone finishes the conversation, I said quietly. He didn't push further. Command ordered aviation withdrawal, I continued. Weather was worsening. The logic was sound from a certain angle. Robert stared at the table. One aircraft turned back, then another. And you held position, Robert said. I held position. Dennis frowned, working through it. Why? I looked at him directly. Because the men on the ground were still answering their radio. Nobody said anything for a moment. There are statements that require time to actually land. That was one of them. I continued slowly. I heard one of the soldiers during the final approach, static in and out. He was talking in a way that told me he didn't believe anyone was coming. Robert's jaw tightened. He was reciting something, he said almost too quietly to hear. Yes, I swallowed carefully. He believed it was over. The patio was so silent I could hear the field insects beyond the fence line singing at full volume in the dark. Descent was instrument only, I said. No visual reference on terrain. No visibility on the contact engagement. barely readable instrument cluster from the cockpit vibration. Dennis stared at me. And you landed. Hardest approach of my career. I let myself stay in that memory for a moment. The rotor noise. The dust forcing itself through every seal. The alarms. Then the gunfire, the particular sound of rounds entering the airframe, a sound that has no equivalent and never fades. The element was already carrying their wounded when we touched down, I said. One man had lost most of a leg from the knee. Another was barely holding on to consciousness. Gerald covered his eyes with one hand briefly. We were loading the last of them when the secondary detonation hit nearby. Robert nodded. That started the fire. That started the fire, I confirmed. The smell returned the moment I said it. I have no control over that hydraulic fluid burning, metal burning, something else I never learned to name burning. Some things live permanently in the olfactory system. Dennis was staring at me like a man who had just realized the furniture in the room he'd been sitting in his entire life was rearranged. How did you get out of there? I rubbed an old scar on my palm reflex, after all these years. That's the part people usually label heroic, I said. Robert watched me carefully. But you don't. No, I paused. Heroism suggests you had the luxury of choosing. Most of us in that moment were simply operating inside whatever option remained. I let that settle before continuing. We lifted off overweight, in deteriorating visibility, in an active contact zone. With fire in the airframe, Robert added softly. With fire in the airframe. My cousin near the patio door whispered something to the person beside her. I shook my head, not at her, just at the gap between how war sounds in the telling and what it actually is in the living. Movies end with a resolution, I said. This didn't end cleanly. The official incident report listed the primary cause as mechanical systems failure. Dennis frowned. But that wasn't accurate. No, I paused. It wasn't. Robert exhaled slowly and deliberately. The commanding officer responsible for the operation, I said carefully, made the withdrawal call before the ground element was secure. Gerald looked up. But if everyone pulled back, the men on the ground would have died, Robert said flatly. They nearly did anyway, I said. But after we returned, after the noise settled and the after-action process began, a different kind of machinery started turning. Dennis blinked. What kind of machinery? I laughed, and it carried no warmth at all. Career machinery, institutional machinery, the kind that runs on reputation and connection and the need to make sure that blame lands somewhere that doesn't destroy anyone important. Robert's expression hardened into something cold and very still. The officer responsible had sponsors, I said. Mentors in positions of authority. And someone needed to carry the accountability for an operation that went badly public. Dennis stared at me. You, me, nobody reached for their drinks. Nobody shifted in their chairs. The formal findings stated I had acted in violation of withdrawal orders, I said. That I had demonstrated reckless disregard for aviation assets and personnel. Robert said a word quietly under his breath that I won't repeat here. I contested it, I said. It didn't matter. The documentation was already shaped by the time the formal process began. Robert shook his head, and the fury behind his eyes told me he had been carrying this anger nearly as long as I had. He'd just been carrying it from a different position. Dennis spoke carefully, feeling for the edges of it. So they punished you for going back in. I held his gaze. They punished me for making someone important look like what he was. That hit him differently than the combat did. Because some kinds of wrong are abstract until they're not. And a decorated officer using institutional power to bury the truth about his own conduct on a night when soldiers almost didn't come home, that's the kind of wrong that people over a certain age recognize from too many other contexts. I leaned back slowly. After that, everything else accelerated. My voice stayed level, though the memory did not. My marriage ended. My sleep ended. The ability to be in crowds, in certain spaces, around certain sounds, most of that ended too. Robert lowered his eyes. I heard about your husband. He said the war kept more of me than he was ever given. I let that statement sit without commentary. Because what is there to add? Some losses have clean explanations. That one did not. Dennis looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked at me. So all these years you've just been carrying all of that alone? I gave a small shrug. It gets lighter, I said. Mostly, the tension across the patio loosened for exactly one moment. Then Robert spoke again, and the warmth evaporated immediately. The officer who authored those findings, he said quietly, he's in the state. My stomach went cold. He's delivering remarks at the Veterans Fundraiser in Franklin tomorrow evening, Robert said. His voice was completely flat. I already knew the name before it came out of his mouth. Gordon Merritt. Retired general. Handsome, silver-haired, the kind of man whose confidence reads as competence to anyone who hasn't seen what's underneath it. A man who was apparently 1 hour down the interstate. I did not sleep that night. This is worth naming specifically because people assume that after enough time, the past loses its ability to keep you awake. That is not accurate. Time changes the texture of the pain, not its presence. I sat on the back porch of my house outside of town and listened to the dark and let the old sounds return on their own terms. Rotor vibration, radio static, voices fragmenting across corrupted bandwidth, the smell of smoke. By the time morning came, my chest felt like I'd already lived the whole day twice. Robert called at around 9:30. Are you going? No, you should consider it. I've been considering walking away from men like Merritt for 20 years, Robert. He was quiet for a moment. Margaret, he said the first time he'd used my given name. There is a difference between avoiding pain and avoiding the end of it. Avoiding pain long enough starts to feel like survival. It isn't. I hated that he was right. Retired soldiers should not be allowed to be philosophical before 10 in the morning. By 6:45 that evening, I was standing in the parking lot of the Franklin Veterans Center trying to remember why I hadn't listened to myself. The building was lit up and full, well-maintained vehicles, American flags flanking the entrance, the kind of crowd that shows up when a fundraiser has a name attached to it that guarantees their photo appears somewhere respectable. Inside, warm lighting, woodwork, people in blazers and cocktail attire holding wine. The room smelled like candles and old money. It smelled like the kind of place where sacrifice is honored at a comfortable distance. Robert met me inside the entrance. You came. Still deciding if I have good judgment. He gave me a faint smile that acknowledged the exact weight of what I was doing there. And then I saw Gordon Merritt. He was positioned near the stage surrounded by donors, city officials, a local reporter with a camera crew hovering at a respectful distance. He wore his confidence like a second set of decorations. People moved toward him in the way people move toward anyone who has learned to occupy a room like they own it. Veterans thanked him for his service. Women in elegant dresses smiled at whatever he said. He looked precisely like the man America tends to trust immediately and investigate never. Robert noticed my face. Still okay? No. Merritt turned slightly, laughing at something in his circle. Then his eyes caught mine across the room. The laugh died at its root, not confusion, recognition, the instant, unambiguous kind, and underneath it, fear, fast and small, but absolutely real. 20 years hadn't made him brave enough to look at me without it. He excused himself and crossed toward us with the measured walk of a man who has learned how to approach things he would prefer to avoid. He stopped a few feet away. Margaret Donovan. His voice had the same register I remembered. Controlled, smooth, that bothered me more than it should have. General Merritt. His eyes tracked over me carefully. You look well. You look comfortable, I said. They usually go together. Robert made a small sound beside me that he covered with a cough. Merritt's eyes went cool. He lowered his voice. This isn't an appropriate venue. You chose the venue, I said, equally quiet. 20 years ago. The air between us had gone tight enough to feel physical. People near us had begun reading the body language and creating distance without quite knowing why. Merritt's curated expression returned thinner this time. Still carrying that, I see. Still building that, I see, I replied. Robert stepped fractionally forward, old instinct. The ballroom lights dimmed shortly after. Guests settled. Robert and I took seats toward the back of the room. Pride was the only thing keeping me in my chair, and I knew it. That is the unglamorous truth about certain kinds of confrontation. Sometimes the motive is not justice. Sometimes it is simply that you are exhausted by the act of swallowing something indefinitely. Merritt was introduced to extended applause, a standing ovation before a word was spoken. I remained seated. Robert remained seated. He began with the expected language service, sacrifice, honor, country. He was very good at it. Men like Merritt usually are. They have spent years learning which words land with which audiences, and older American audiences respond to that particular vocabulary with a deep, earned sincerity that makes the whole room feel unified. That is what made it so effective as a shield. His eyes found me at the back table, and something shifted in his cadence. Unfortunately, he said, his voice carrying warmly across the room, some personnel never fully integrate back into civilian life. Robert stiffened beside me. Merritt continued with practiced gentleness. Prolonged combat exposure affects cognition. Emotional regulation. The ability to accurately reconstruct events. Several people near the front were nodding. Some of them were glancing toward the back of the room now. He was doing it again, the same thing he had done 20 years ago, using careful, measured language to build a wall around the truth before anyone could reach it. Leadership, Merritt said, spreading his hands slightly, sometimes requires choices that those operating at lower levels of command are not equipped to contextualize. The old anger, the one I had spent 2 decades in a managed negotiation with, came fully awake. He smiled faintly toward the audience, and then he said, quietly and sadly, as if it pained him to mention it, that some former service members construct narratives around their own experiences that serve psychological rather than factual purposes. Robert's hand hit the table, hard enough to rattle the glasses around us. Every head in our section turned. Merritt's eyes found him immediately. And Robert Hatch, retired Army Ranger, 72 years old, stood up. I was there. His voice reached the entire room without effort. You don't lose that projection. Merritt's polished expression cracked slightly at the edges. Robert, he said, controlled and quiet. You've had the floor long enough, Robert said. The room held its breath. He extended one hand toward me, palm open. That woman flew into a firestorm that every other aircraft had withdrawn from, while you were transmitting the withdrawal order. The room erupted in whispered movement. Merritt's face had gone pale under the ballroom lighting. You don't have the full picture, Merritt said sharply. I have the same picture I had 20 years ago, Robert said. I just stopped letting you describe it for me. Then a different voice spoke. From near the front of the room. Older, slow with effort. A man in a wheelchair, grey-bearded, former Marine, by the patches on his jacket, one trouser leg folded and pinned above where the knee used to be, had raised himself slightly in his seat. She brought me home, he said. And then it happened the way these things sometimes happen, the way a single moment pulls everything beneath the surface up into the light. Another veteran rose. Then a man near the aisle. Then an older woman in the second row who stood holding a military photograph to her chest. A voice said, "She carried my son out of that valley." Another said, "We were told nobody had authorization to come in." And another, "I was unconscious." She loaded me herself. Merritt's entire physical presence had changed. The man who had commanded every room he entered for 2 decades was suddenly occupying less space than everyone around him. He stood at the podium without anything left to say to it. Robert turned to look at me, and the Marine in the wheelchair raised a trembling hand to his forehead. Slowly, deliberately, and held a salute. The room watched. Some with wet eyes, some with visible shame, some just frozen, processing the distance between who they had believed Gordon Merritt was and what they were observing. I sat in that moment and felt something strange and unexpected. I did not feel victory. I felt the particular exhaustion of truth finally arriving at a place it should have reached 20 years ago and being too tired to celebrate the fact. The room never fully settled again after that. People remained in their seats, but the architecture of the evening had changed completely. Merritt finished his remarks with visible effort and to a different quality of response than the ovation he had received going in. The applause at the end was respectful the way people are respectful to something they no longer believe in but haven't yet decided to criticize aloud. Robert leaned close. "How are you?" I watched Merritt step away from the stage and begin the long process of avoiding eye contact with half the room. "Ask me later," I said. Which was the truth. I had spent most of my adult life imagining what this moment would feel like, the specific quality of justice, the particular relief of it. The actual thing felt mostly like fatigue, not disappointment. Just the understanding that some resolutions come too late to feel the way you needed them to feel when you needed them. The fundraiser wound down. Veterans and donors clustered in the lobby, voices lower than they'd been 2 hours earlier. Several men made their way to me with the particular quiet that combat veterans use when they're extending respect, not dramatically, not with ceremony, just directly. A former ranger held my hand briefly and said, "You brought our people home." A Vietnam-era veteran in a weathered cap simply embraced me without speaking at all. That carried more than most sentences could. Then a woman in her late 60s pressed a photograph into my hand. Small photograph, slightly worn at the edges. Young soldier, desert equipment, enormous smile. "My son mentioned you in letters," she said, "before we lost him." I looked at the image. My chest did what it does. "I remember him," I said. And I did. I remember all of them. That is the part of survival that no one explains in advance. You carry every face indefinitely. The ones who made it and the ones who didn't are catalogued in you permanently, without your consent, without any mechanism for editing. She squeezed my hand. "He wrote that you were the only calm thing in a very terrifying night." I almost laughed. I have never once been calm in a military operation. I have been controlled. I have been functional. I have been too focused on the next task to process what I was feeling. But calm? Not once. Soldiers often mistake focused terror for steadiness. I have never corrected them. Robert and I eventually walked outside into the warm Franklin night. Traffic moved along the nearby road with complete indifference to what had just happened inside that building. Robert lit a cigarette, despite the clear evidence that his body had asked him to stop doing that at least a decade ago. "Word is going to move fast through the network," he said. I assumed. He leaned against the railing. "You understand that the call sign is going to surface again." "I understand." He looked at me sideways. "You spent 20 years disappearing. One barbecue," I said, "and one evening in Franklin." He actually laughed, a real one. It surprised us both. Then he was serious again. "You deserved better than what you received, Margaret." I looked out into the parking lot lights. There is an age at which hearing that statement changes character. Early in life, it lands as vindication. Later, after enough time has restructured your understanding of what fairness actually offers, it lands more softly. As acknowledgement. As the spoken version of a debt that will never be fully settled, but is at least no longer pretended away. "You know my greatest regret?" I asked. He waited. I let it make me a person who stayed alone. He didn't answer. Because he understood exactly what I meant. Combat veterans build extraordinary architecture around solitude. We become very skilled at making aloneness feel like choice. And after enough years, it starts to feel indistinguishable from preference. That transition is dangerous and happens slowly enough that most of us don't notice it until we're standing in a parking lot in Tennessee talking about it at 70 years old. By the following morning, my phone had begun doing something it hadn't done since before I left active service. It rang. Repeatedly, former pilots. Old medics. A retired Special Forces instructor I hadn't spoken to in 15 years. One man called and was crying before I had said hello. Another said only, "We never believed the report. I wanted you to know that. That one was the hardest." Because somewhere beneath the constructed independence of the past 2 decades, a part of me had assumed that the official version had replaced the truth entirely. That everyone had simply accepted the documentation and moved on. They hadn't. Silence and abandonment turn out to be different things. I had to sit with that for a while. Just before noon, Dennis's truck appeared in my driveway. I was working in the garden when I heard the gravel. He climbed out holding a paper bag from the bakery 2 towns over and looked exactly the way large. Confident men look when they know they were wrong and have run out of ways to avoid accounting for it. "What's in the bag?" I called over. "Peach fritters." He shifted on his feet. "The good ones." That's a significant apology. He rubbed his neck. "Can I come in?" We sat at my kitchen table. The ceiling fan hummed. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and stared into it for longer than necessary. "I owe you something," he finally said. "You do. I was a horse's rear end at the cookout." "You were." He managed a small smile. Then it faded. "I genuinely thought you were, I don't know, exaggerating, playing up some old desk job to seem interesting." "I know." "No, I mean," he stopped and started over. "I thought maybe you just wanted people to pay attention to you. Because you always seemed lonely." That surprised me enough that I didn't answer immediately. He looked at my kitchen wall. "I was building a whole story around your silence," he said, "and I never once thought to ask what was actually in it." The sincerity in his voice was not what I expected from Dennis. It was not a performance. He looked like a man who had been genuinely rearranged by something. "You've been carrying all of this by yourself," he said. I gave a small shrug. "For a while." He shook his head slowly. He looked around the kitchen, small, functional, organized, the kitchen of a person who lives practically and alone. "That general," he said quietly. "How does somebody do that and then spend the next 20 years accepting awards for it?" I thought about Gordon Merritt on that stage. Confident, surrounded, applauded, and I gave Dennis the most honest answer I had. "Probably the same way anyone manages to survive a thing they're ashamed of," I said. "They find a version of the story that they can inhabit." Dennis thought about that. Then he nodded once, slowly, like something had settled. 3 days after that, Merritt called. I stared at my phone for a long time before answering. Curiosity is a reliable weakness. He sounded older, not physically. Something beneath the voice had changed, something structural. "Margaret," he said, "I would like to meet." Every piece of my own common sense said no. I said yes. We met at a diner outside of Brentwood. Coffee, laminate tables, a mounted television playing sports with the sound off. Nothing built for the weight of the conversation we were about to have. Merritt looked diminished. That is the word that kept returning to me as I sat across from him. The perfect posture remained, but something animating it had been quietly disassembled. Without the platform, without the audience, without the decorations. He was simply a man in his late 70s with untouched coffee and something uncomfortable living behind his eyes. He looked at his cup for a long time before speaking. "I was afraid," he said. I said nothing. When the storm developed and the comms went down and the reports started coming in, I panicked. He said it plainly, without architecture around it. I issued the withdrawal because I panicked. Not because it was the right tactical decision. There it was, not strategy, not leadership calculation. Fear, plain human fear, wearing a star on its collar. His eyes had moisture in them now. I told myself it was the defensible decision. The documentable decision. He swallowed. But the truth was available to me every time I heard your name. Every time someone mentioned Kunar Province. The diner was quiet, older couples at nearby tables, a waitress moving between booths, the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday morning. I hated you, he admitted, and his voice broke slightly on it, because you made it impossible to forget what I actually was. I studied him carefully. This was the man whose decisions had cost me my marriage, my career, my sleep, my sense of safety in the world. A decade of functional living. And sitting across from him now, he just looked like someone who had outlived the version of himself he'd built as protection. After 20 years, he said slowly, why didn't you go public sooner? You could have destroyed my reputation at any point. I held that question for a long moment. Because hatred is its own kind of sentence, I said finally. I'd already served enough of one. He nodded. Once his jaw moved as if he might say something further, and then decided against it. We sat in silence for a while. Two people with different kinds of damage sitting in a diner outside Brentwood on a Tuesday, the world moving outside the windows at its usual pace. Merritt finally spoke again. I don't expect forgiveness, he said. Good, I replied. Because forgiveness isn't a transaction. It's not something I owe you in exchange for a confession. He nodded again, and this time it looked like relief. Not the relief of absolution, something quieter, the relief of no longer maintaining the pretense. We finished our coffee. We did not shake hands. We walked out through separate doors. About a week after that, Robert invited me to a veteran support gathering in a town 20 minutes south of me. Small room, folding chairs, community centre smell old coffee and floor wax. No ceremony, no decorations, just veterans, various ages, various branches, sitting in a circle trying to help each other do the difficult work of remaining functional after the military finishes with you. I would normally have declined immediately. I have a long history of declining exactly this kind of invitation. Too many ghosts in close proximity. The weight of collective memory in a room like that is something you can feel before you sit down. But something had shifted in the week since the cookout in Franklin. Something had loosened inside me that I hadn't realized was still locked. So I said yes. Robert introduced me simply. This is Margaret. No rank, no title, no story attached, just a name. I appreciated that more than he probably registered. The group was a mix. Young veterans recently back from overseas rotations, visibly still in the early stages of learning how to be back. A few older men from Vietnam who had spent decades getting very good at appearing fine. A Marine with 2 missing fingers. A man who sat quietly through the entire early portion of the meeting without making eye contact with anyone. I recognized that silence from the inside. Robert eventually asked if I would share something. My first instinct was to say no. Then I noticed a young woman sitting against the far wall, early 30s, rigid posture. Eyes fixed on the floor with the specific internal distance of someone who has decided the room cannot be trusted yet. I knew that posture. I had held it for years. I stood slowly. People hear military service stories, I began, and they tend to believe the hardest part is the combat. Several heads nodded. The combat is survivable, I said. The afterward is what requires the longer work. The room was completely still. You come home, I continued, and everyone around you is operating on the assumption that you can simply re-enter the previous frequency. That you set the military aside the way you set down a bag, and then you pick up the life that was there before. A few short sounds in the room recognition expressed as breath. But war recalibrates the instrument, I said. Sleep, crowds, sound, safety, all of it registers differently afterward. Not because something is broken. Because the calibration was accurate for the environment, and the environment changed. The young woman against the wall had looked up. For years, I believed that isolation was protection, I said. that keeping people at distance kept the past at distance too. I gave a small pause. That is not true, I said. The past does not stay where you leave it. Isolation just means you deal with it alone. Someone near the door raised a hand. Older veteran, probably mid-70s. Can I ask something? Of course. He hesitated. Why Reaper? Several people in the room shifted with curiosity. I looked at my hands for a moment. Over the years, people constructed their own meanings for the call sign. Most assumed it was meant as something dark, threatening, an identity built around violence or fear. The first team that used that name for me, I said quietly, gave it after a recovery mission went badly wrong. The room held its breath. One of the men told me afterward wherever things got bad enough that they thought it was finished, I showed up. I let that land. They weren't naming what I was, I said. They were naming what I did. Nobody spoke for a long time afterward. Because some statements don't require response. They require the space to settle into the people who needed to hear them. After the meeting broke up, a cluster of younger veterans stayed longer than the official end time, talking in the particular way that people talk when they've found a room that feels safer than expected. One thanked me for saying the word isolation out loud, in a context where it wasn't being used as a character flaw. Another admitted quietly that he hadn't called his brother in 4 months and wasn't entirely sure why. That one stayed with me on the drive home. The young woman from the wall found me at the coffee table as people were gathering their things. She looked like she had practiced what she was about to say. "Do you think it's actually possible?" she asked. "To get through the other side of it?" "The other side of what?" I asked, though I knew. She searched for the word. The distance. The darkness. I held her gaze and answered as honestly as I knew how. "Not entirely," I said, "but enough to want to be present. Enough to let people back in. Enough to call your brother." Her eyes filled. She nodded once. And that small nod from a 28-year-old veteran standing by a folding table with bad coffee in a community center south of Nashville meant more to me in that moment than anything that happened in Franklin. I drove home beneath a Tennessee sky that was doing what Tennessee skies do in summer evenings, turning impossible colors at the edges. Orange fading into deep red, fading into the particular blue that comes right before full dark. Windows down. The air carrying the mix of fields and distance that I have come to understand, after all this time, as the specific smell of home. I thought about Gerald and Dennis and Robert, about Gordon Merritt at a table in Brentwood, about the woman with the photograph of her son, about the young soldier whose voice I heard through broken radio static, reciting something because he believed the night was over. All of us carrying different versions of the same essential wound, some expressing it through arrogance, some through guilt, some through the particular armor of a life built carefully to ensure that no one gets close enough to see what's underneath it. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the truck a few minutes longer than necessary. The fields around my property settling into evening quiet. People assumed for 20 years that the call sign meant something dark, something final, a name for death or violence or things that can't be undone. They were wrong. It was a name for the act of going back, for refusing to accept that the people behind you were beyond reach, for continuing into the dark not because you were unafraid, but because the alternative was something you couldn't live inside. Maybe that's not a military concept. Maybe that's just a human one. Maybe some of us spend years in silence because we've come to believe that silence is strength, that carrying pain privately is the same as managing it, that the distance we build to protect ourselves isn't costing us something we can't price until we finally let someone close enough to see it. Maybe the bravest thing is not the approach under fire. Maybe it's the door you finally decide to open after spending 2 decades convincing yourself you preferred it closed. If something in this story moved you, if it pulled up something in your own experience of loss, or pride, or the particular weight of things carried too long alone, I hope you'll carry that feeling towards someone who needs it. Share it with someone who might recognize themselves in it. If this is your first time here, this is Winds of Thought stories about the people we overlook, the truths we bury, and the moments that change the shape of everything after. If something here was worth your time, please like this video and stay with us. We'll be right here.